Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive, where we take your detailed articles, your research, and all your scattered notes and deliver the clearest insights directly to you. Our single mission is to give you a rapid shortcut to being truly well informed on a topic. Today, we're embarking on an analysis of a single Greek preposition. It's deceptively simple, often translated as just from. We are diving into ek, or its phonetic variant. Now, you might wonder how much intellectual real estate a two-letter word can really occupy. But understanding its specific grammar, and maybe even more so, the conceptual migration it facilitates in Greek thought, well, it's key to unpacking the structure of some critical theological and historical arguments.
Is a spectacular piece of language to dissect.
Yeah.
Our objective today is to meticulously examine egg as the singular linguistic marker of source and origin. We need to trace the trajectory of its meaning, starting from its most basic physical definition, literally coming out of a container, and then see how that simple idea is extended, how it grows to cover abstract concepts like cause, means, lineage, and even time. We'll move logically from that radical spatial sense to its more metaphorical uses, using the cognitive framework of the landmark and the trajector to connect every single dot.
So we're really treating this word as a map that shows us where everything begins. Okay, let's unpack this and maybe start with the raw mechanics. The first rule about ek is simple, but it is completely inflexible. It governs the genitive case exclusively. And, this is a rule with zero exceptions in standard coin usage. If you see X, the noun that follows it must be in the genitive. You just won't find it paired with the accusative, the case for a direct object or motion toward, or the dative, which is more about static location or interest.
And that rigidity, it provides immense semantic value. It signals instantly to the reader or the listener that the noun following it is meant to be understood as the source, the origin, or the derivation. This lines up perfectly with the natural function of the genitive case in Greek. The genitive is inherently the case of, separation, possession, and derivation. So it was already doing the job of defining where something comes from.
I think the analogy we had is just excellent for visualizing the structure. Think of the genitive case as the warehouse. It holds the source. The preposition E is the shipping label, and that label has to explicitly say sent from. You can't just stick the label E on a package without giving the warehouse address. And that's the genitive noun. It really highlights that the separation is always defined by the source itself.
That's a great way to put it.
Correct.
It doesn't just mean away from. It adds the crucial detail of movement from the interior outwards. And that detail immediately sets it apart from a closely related preposition, eat, which also governs the genitive and can also be translated as from or away from.
Right, and that distinction is crucial. When does the Greek language choose over a currivial?
If you're studying Greek at any level, this is such a key insight. Typically denotes separation from a surface or a boundary. So think of standing away from a crowd or separating from the edge of a cliff. The landmark in that case is treated as an exterior reference point. But ik, on the other hand, describes motion out of a bounded space, a container, an interior. The landmark is always conceptualized as having an inside and an outside.
Okay, so I step away from the wall, that's ep. But if I step out of the room, that's ek.
Precisely. Ek is the preposition of emergence. Ek is the preposition of distance. This grammatical choice is always loaded with semantic intent, and the rule ensures that when you encounter ek, you are always identifying the source as an encompassing container or, a structured interior. But before we move on to meaning, we should probably address the small but necessary detail of the morphological variations. Why do we sometimes see X instead of ik?
It's all about smooth articulation. It's a sound check, really. The research suggests that the language just prefers to adapt the sound for ease of speaking. The main form, E, is consistently used before words that start with consonants. But when the following word starts with a vowel, or sometimes a rough breathing mark, the kappa is typically replaced by the E, making it it.
And the most common and famous example of this is exarches, meaning from the beginning. We try to say ik arches, that pause created by the meeting of the hard key in the following A is, well, it's a bit awkward. It just flows much more smoothly into the next word.
And we also saw that rarer form, eek, which can appear before specific voiced consonants like beta, gamma, delta, lambda, and mu. This is, again, purely a matter of phonetics, matching a guttural sound with another voiced consonant for a more natural transition.
And it's important to stress that these variations do not affect the meaning or the grammar at all. They're just surface-level adjustments that confirm the deep-level structural rules. Ek always requires the genitive, and it always signifies movement away from the interior of the landmark. So to frame our discussion going forward, we really need to internalize this cognitive model,
Mhm.
the trajector and the landmark. The landmark is the reference point, the source, the container, the boundary we're exiting. And the trajector is the moving entity, the person, the object, the abstract idea that is separating from or originating from that landmark. The key is that Eck always describes the trajector moving out from within the landmark. This simple framework lets us connect physical geography to high theology.
That clarity trajector moving away from the interior of the landmark, that's the constant thread we need to hold on to. Okay, so let's focus on the literal core meaning. The radical sense of X is from out of, which establishes it as the direct spatial opposite of X into. So if you can enter something with X, you can exit it with X.
The physical examples are the most straightforward because the landmark is usually a solid, discernible container. We see this with basic movement. Going out of the city, eklos palaches. The city walls or its boundaries are the container. The subject, the trajector, was demonstrably inside those boundaries just moments before.
And this radical sense, it takes on a dramatic resonance when it's applied to concepts like death and resurrection. The sources really highlight that the most powerful separation events use ik, rising from the dead or rising out of sleep. Death and sleep are both treated conceptually as bounded spaces, as containers from which the subject is delivered.
And this is where that ik versus apro distinction really delivers linguistic precision.
Yep.
Resurrection is described using ik because it means emerging out of the state of death, which is viewed as an interior confining condition. In contrast, if a text used ip for resurrection, it might just mean separating from the boundary of death, which would imply a lot less containment.
And that specific gospel mechanism cited in the notes, the stone being rolled away from the tomb entrance, that's up, right? Rolling away from the surface, but the person emerges the tomb.
Exactly. The stone is the mouth of the tomb. It's separating from the surface. But the action of the resurrected person is coming on the tomb, emerging from the interior. The linguistic choices align perfectly with the physical reality.
Okay, so that spatial idea of separation quickly extends to abstract deliverance and rescue, where the landmark isn't a geographical location, but a source of danger or control.
Yes, here the containment is coercive. We often encounter the Hebrewistic idiom for separation from an enemy's hand. Ekitos keros is the technical term in the sources.
Let's define that jargon quickly. What does Hebrewistic idiom signal for the listener?
It just indicates a phrase structure or a usage common in Semitic languages like Hebrew that has been translated literally into Greek. In this context, hand isn't literal. It's a recognized euphemism for control, authority, or power. So being rescued, iktos keros, means being delivered from a person's authority or their power structure.
We see this so vividly in the example of Peter in Acts 12:11, where he is delivered ik cheros herdu. He wasn't just rescued from Herod's physical grasp, but from the entire legal and political mechanism, the power that Herod wielded over him. That power structure is the conceptual container.
And the same logic applies to spiritual danger. The sources mention being saved from death or being kept from the evil one, like in John 17:1. In these cases, the negative state, death, or the negative entity, the evil one, is treated as a confining structure, a container from which the trajector, the believer, is pulled out or protected from entering. It clarifies the nature of salvation as an extraction.
Now, what about that interesting outlier? That small use where E marks a seemingly static position, sometimes translated as on or at, like sitting on the right, indexation. If E means motion out of, how can it mark a fixed position?
That's a great challenge. The sources clarify that this usage still retains the concept of separation, but it uses it to establish location by perspective. When we say someone is sitting indexation, it doesn't mean they moved out of the right side and are now just floating in space. It means their position is established by identifying the source region they occupy, the right side, away from the central axis, or the focal point, the landmark.
So if the central figure is the landmark, sitting ekidexish defines the location as being in the space that originates from or is defined by the right-hand area relative to that center. It's static, but the definition of that space is based on the source of the directional separation.
Precisely. It's establishing a fixed point by reference to a source region. It maintains the core identity of ek as defining the trajector's position relative to a source, even if the trajector isn't currently moving. It's kind of a spatial snapshot taken from the perspective of the landmark.
So we've successfully navigated physical space and coercion. How does this out-of-concept handle lineage and material? Now we're shifting the landmark from a location to the point of origin for a person or an object or a concept. Eek moves from tracking movement to tracking provenance, the genesis of the trajector.
This is a crucial conceptual bridge, where source becomes synonymous with composition.
Mm-hmm.
We are asking, what is the original material container? This is a cognitive leap that the Greek language just makes effortlessly.
Let's look at material composition. The substance that something is constructed out of becomes the landmark. The final object is the trajector that emerges from that source material.
The examples are highly instructive. A whip made of cords, exoanion. The cords are the landmark, the raw constituent source material. The whip, the trajector, emerges from and is defined by those cords. We see the same with a crown made of thorns. The thorns are the source substance. The product is physically separated in its form, but it's derived intrinsically from that material source.
The logic stays consistent. The final product flows out of the source material, and this leads naturally to biological and lineage origin.
This is perhaps the most common non-spatial application. It's the standard use for birth or ancestry, with the parent or the ancestor acting as the biological source, the landmark. The New Testament frequently uses the example of being born of a woman, gekinikos. This is just stating the genetic and physical source from which the person proceeds. Likewise, tracing ancestry to the seed of David. The lineage acts as the container of identity.
And this genealogical use does more than just state facts. It emphasizes that the source inherently defines the nature of the derived item. If the source is human, the product is human.
And that very quickly generalizes to the internal source, which is critical for ethical discussions. Ebenarch is the source of actions, thoughts, and emotions that flow from one's inner life. The heart, the mind, or the mouth become the bounded container, the landmark from which the trajector, words, deeds, emotions proceeds.
For instance, speaking from the heart. Or, perhaps more powerfully, the teaching that evil actions flow out of the mouth or the corrupted heart. The internal state is the source material.
The sources cite the Lucan and Matthean accounts that link gifts or words to one's abundance, ek to perisuantos. The abundance is the landmark, the supply inside. The gifts, or the words, are the trajector, proceeding out of that interior supply. This is such a powerful metaphor. The quality of the stream, the actions, is determined by the quality of the source, the inner abundance.
This moves directly into the divine origin application, which is, central to our understanding of the faith. Ik is the primary preposition used to define the ultimate, uncreated source of spiritual reality.
Indeed. When we speak of righteousness from God, ek theio, or the state of being born of God, the linguistic structure places God as the landmark, the singular source from which that spiritual reality, righteousness, or new birth proceeds. The preposition confirms that the spiritual life must originate out of God's nature, not just be adjacent to it or separated from it, which would be apo.
And the linguistic function itself remains neutral. It simply defines derivation, regardless of the quality. This is so crucial for avoiding selective reading.
Absolutely. The sources list the converse, belonging of the evil one in 1 John 3.1, which defines Cain's actions as deriving out of that detrimental source. It doesn't inherently imply goodness, it simply defines the source of the derivation. It compels you, the listener, to acknowledge the origin, and that origin defines the character of the outflowing trajector. It tells you the provenance, and that provenance carries consequence.
So we've seen place and lineage. How does this out-of-concept handle groups? That separation idea seems to hold even when we're just selecting a subset, right? Als frequently abstracts again to take on a partitive function. This is where it often takes the place of the simple partitive genitive to indicate a subset drawn from a larger group.
That's right. For those who might be unfamiliar, the partitive genitive is just the grammatical concept of taking a part of a whole, for instance, a piece of bread. Ik often replaces the simple genitive construction to make the selection out of the whole explicit and more vivid. The core idea of separation is maintained. A smaller trajector is separated or selected out of a larger landmark.
Our notes clarify two distinct types of partitives. Let's start with entity partitives, where the landmark is a single physical item or mass.
These are very straightforward. They involve consuming or using a portion of a whole. Eating of the bread, ektuor 2. The bread mass is the landmark, the source, and the specific bite that's taken is the trajector, the portion separated out of it. This function illustrates sharing from a finite, single-source item. It maintains that physical link to the container.
Then we move to set partitives, which are more abstract. They deal with collective groups that are treated as a whole, the landmark from which an individual or a subset is identified as the trajector.
Here, the boundary shifts from a physical mass to an abstract boundary that's defined by shared features, like a geographic group, a crowd, or a belief system. We see examples like one of the elders or some from the crowd. The crowd or the body of elders are the bounded set, the container, and the individual is the trajector who is singled out or selected.
And this partitive use becomes vitally important when defining identity and belonging in socio-religious contexts.
This is where ik acts as a defining boundary marker. The entire group is the landmark. We read about belonging to the circumcision party, hoi ik tus Bertomes, or being of the Pharisees. It defines identity not simply by what the person is right now, but by the group they proceed from or belong to.
It effectively draws a conceptual circle around a group and marks the individual as having emerged from or fundamentally belonging to that particular set of people or beliefs. It's an explicit statement of shared origin and thus shared identity.
It solidifies the idea that identity is derived from its source. If you are ictus peritomes, your identity and your operational framework flows out of that particular group's tradition and interpretation. And this usage also holds true quantitatively with simple counting. One of the disciples, two of them, is just an efficient way to select a component from a larger collection.
This next pivot is fascinating. We're taking that defined spatial boundary and mapping it entirely onto time. The landmark moves from a physical location to a specific point in time, marking the starting point of a duration.
The brilliance here is how the cognitive model is maintained without any change. Just as physical separation creates distance and space, the temporal usage maps that separation onto distance and time. The moment of origin is the temporal landmark, and the subsequent duration is the trajector moving away from that point, measuring the lapse of time.
So A defines the moment from which a state proceeds, meaning we translate it as from or since. We use phrases like from youth, ek neotetos, or the highly common from the beginning, ex arches.
These examples establish duration based on a fixed point. The beginning, the arche, is the stationary landmark reference, and the ongoing duration is the movement of time away from it. The research points out historical duration examples. Since the world began, ek to aisnos, or even less specified durations like for a long time, ex hikanon chronun, which is literally from considerable times. The period flows out of that initial moment.
And a specific and very common example cited in the sources is the idiomatic phrase related to birth. Ek koulas mitas, literally, out of the womb of a mother.
Right, and while it describes a physical event, its purpose is temporal definition. It functions as a standard recognizable idiom, meaning from birth or born so. It marks a condition that has existed from the absolute temporal beginning of that person's life history. The physical separation out of the womb serves as the definitive temporal marker.
This is more than just describing a moment. The sources use the example of those who are born eunuchs in Matthew 19:12. Ik is defining the starting point of their lifelong condition, showing an existence that proceeded out of that initial state.
And moving beyond just a single point of origin, ik is also used to denote succession and sequence, where the new unit proceeds conceptually out of the former. Time is viewed as a flow, where the previous unit acts as the immediate source for the next.
Like saying day after day, which is literally day from day.
The preceding day is the source out of which the new day emerges, creating a continuous flow. This sequence definition is also used in ordering. For the second time, iku deutero, or in the third place, the ordering proceeds logically, one step from the previous step.
Okay, this pivot into the logical realm is where the meaning gets most profound. We're taking the concept of source and abstracting it completely so that the landmark becomes the reason or the force that produces an effect, the trajector. The result simply flows out of the cause.
This is really the pinnacle of metaphorical mapping in language. The causal shift arises because human cognition naturally links sequence to source. If event A happens and event B is its consequence, we treat A as the source that contains or generates B. Event B is the trajector separating out of the container of event A.
The sources illustrate this with the effective cause marking the event that triggers the resulting effect.
Right. We see people being weary from the journey in John 4:6. The journey is the landmark, the source producing the physical state of weariness, which is the trajector. Or blaspheming God because of their pain in Revelation 16:11. The pain is the source that produces the action of blasphemy. The action is viewed as flowing directly out of that preceding causal event,
And this abstraction also dictates the standard and basis for judgment. It defines the rule or the principle out of which a judgment or a state proceeds. The rule itself becomes the landmark.
Absolutely. The rule or standard provides the defining source boundary. You are judged by your words. Ektu loginsu. Your words are the standard, the source material from which the judgment proceeds. Or performing work in accordance with your ability. Ektu ekrai. Your ability is the established standard, the internal supply that governs the action.
And this conceptual bridge is just fundamental to grasping the next usage, means, and instrument. This is a critical distinction because ik is often misunderstood here.
This usage is where ekrim distinguishes itself from other Greek prepositions for instrumentality, like di, which often means through or by means of, implying a channel or agency. When ik marks the means, the resource used to accomplish the purpose is conceptualized not just as a tool, but as the supply out of which the operation is funded or achieved.
So the landmark has to be viewed as the resource supply or the fund.
Exactly. We see great examples using financial resources. The description of women ministering to Jesus from, by means of, their possessions in Luke 8.3. Their wealth is the resource source, the landmark, that enables their service. The same logic applies to making friends by means of unrighteous mammon in Luke 16.9. The mammon is the supply out of which the friendship is acquired or secured. The resource is the source.
The analogy that helps here is viewing the resource as an operating budget. The activity is accomplished by means of the budget, but the ability to do the activity flows out of the budget.
That dual relationship, resource as supply and supply as source, is precisely what E captures. And this brings us to the most significant theological application cited in the source material, the concept of justification. This is where the preposition is doing the heaviest analytical lifting.
We are referencing those crucial passages in Romans and Galatians, Romans 3.3, Galatians 3.24, that use E to define the relationship between legal standing and its source. We need to be clear about the linguistic necessity here.
U defines the means or the basis through which a legal standing or forensic righteousness is acquired. And to define that quickly for our listeners, forensic righteousness refers to the legal declaration of being righteous in God's sight, not necessarily the internal feeling of being righteous. The discussion centers on the standard by which that declaration is made.
So when we read of being justified by works, ek ergen, or by faith, ek pistas, the preposition, it demands that the preceding noun works or faith be the ultimate non-mixed source that enables the justification.
This is vital because the choice of ek insists on identifying a single sufficient origin. The works, ergen, or the faith, cannot simply be adjacent to or accompany the justification. They must be the necessary singular wellspring out of which the legal declaration proceeds. The linguistic structure actually prohibits a mixed basis.
And this is precisely where the linguistic analysis supports the historical theological discussions about the basis for righteousness. If justification comes ek ergun, the source is human effort, which results in boasting. If justification comes ek pistas, the source is not human effort, but faith, which is itself viewed in the context of our sources as the divinely provided means of reception.
The Greek preposition provides the grammatical structure that affirms the necessity of a single, non-mixed basis for righteousness. If the justification proceeded out of two separate sources, say 50% from works and 50% from faith, the linguistic choice of ik would be highly problematic as it isolates the source. Since the texts contrast ek ergun with ek pistes, ik forces us to identify one and only one source that supplies the legal standing.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that linguistically, justification has to proceed from one single unmixed source, and that structural necessity, enforced by the preposition itself, forces the reader to choose which source, works, or faith is a sufficient landmark for the trajector of justification.
To tie together this whole deep dive, the single elegant concept running through all these uses of ik, whether physical, temporal, partitive, or abstract, is the concept of source or origin. This small preposition is always asking and answering the question, where did this come from? It compels us to identify the landmark that acts as the necessary container or supply. The sheer elegance of ik is that it forces us to ask that critical question of origin every time we encounter it. It demands we identify the single sufficient source, be it a physical cup, a specific century, a social group, or the author of creation itself. Its consistency allows us to track abstract ideas like causation and material composition through the very same conceptual lens as simple motion.
We also briefly touch on the cognates listed in your research. Words like exo, outside, and ektos, outside, apart from. They naturally extend the core concept of being separate or out of a boundary, confirming that the idea of emergence is deeply ingrained in this family of words. We hope this deep dive into one small Greek preposition gives you a new perspective on how language operates, and how one little word can carry the weight of everything from biological lineage to the structural basis of theological conviction. As you close your notes, consider this final thought for your own further reflection. If ek marks the source out of which everything proceeds, what does it mean that Jesus describes the living water of the Spirit as flowing ek tos koilios, literally out of the belly, or innermost being of the believer? Think about the implications of the internal spirit, the core of the self, acting as the necessary spring required for external spiritual life and witness. We appreciate you joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.